Our main character, of course, is an orphan. Her parents were murdered. Honestly, I mean, I'm not the only girl who once in a while likes to book with a booty. People see him as, you know, a thief, a murderer, just this very bad type. So one more year. That's what you got. One more year. Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Leandra, the TBR Zero, and my goal is to lessen my physical TBR one book at a time. Today I am creating my first ever TBR self-destruct video. I'm very excited. I'm very nervous for my future self when I eventually come back to this video and see, did I read all of these books in 2024? And if I didn't, then that means they gotta go whether I read them or not. I ended up being inspired by many booktubers who have done this in the past. I wanted to do it last year, but then I kind of waited too long and just decided not to do it. I was reminded though by Brittany from Brittany Loves Reading, because she was telling me that she was creating her own self-destruct TBR video, and I'm sure by the time this is up, hers is up for this coming year, so I'll make sure to link it below, maybe somewhere on the screen, so you can go check that out. For me, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, so I just perused my shelves, walked around trying to figure out which books I kind of forgot about or ones that I have been meaning to read but just keep putting off. And so I grabbed 15 titles, and what's really interesting about them, you'll see some patterns. They're across various genres, but they all range from 2000 to 2021. So I don't really have many books that I'm looking at before the 21st century. I also realized that a lot of them have dual timelines. Maybe they have a bit of historical fiction involved, matching with a modern day timeline, but there is a lot of historical fiction happening here, and I think that's a trend, showing that I tend to buy them, and yet for whatever reason, I don't tend to read them. So let's get into it. I'll give you a little bit of description of each book. Let me know which ones I probably will enjoy and which ones I've been smart not to try yet, and we're gonna see what happens at the end of 2024 when I review if I've actually read any of them. If you're new here or you've been here before and you've enjoyed my content in the past, this is your reminder to subscribe. I really appreciate all of those who have subscribed to my channel already. I love you all dearly. Thank you for supporting me in the best way possible. With that said, if you aren't sure if you want to subscribe, that's okay. At the end of the video, maybe just like it. Consider commenting your thoughts, reactions to any of the books that I'll be presenting today. Really, any way that you can support my channel, I really appreciate it. All right, let's talk about books. The first book on this list is The Cruel Prince by Holly Black. This originally came out in 2018. It is the first in the Folk of the Air series. I don't think anyone will be surprised that this was definitely a purchase thanks to Book Talk and Book Reels. Those social media platforms were blowing up at the time I was seeing this, at the time that I bought it, and I felt a bit of FOMO and decided to take the leap. I will say that if I do read young adult, it does tend to lean towards fantasy, so I don't really know why I've been waiting so long to read it. I think it's because of how popular it was, even though that popularity is why I bought it. I will say that I'm not sure if it's my cup of tea anymore. I've only had it on my shelves for a handful of years, but I am kind of not into the hate to lovers anymore, or hate to love type of trope that I'm assuming this is going to be. Also, our main character, of course, is an orphan. Her parents were murdered, and now she has to deal with this cruel prince at the high court of fairy, and I think they're immortal, so there's these discussions of immortality. He's the most wicked prince among those that exist, which is kind of something I've been going on a journey on how much I like the idea of gray characters or evil characters as love interests, especially with this being a young adult. So I think that's partially among many reasons why I've been hesitant to try it, but you know what, I keep staring at it, so this is going on my self-destruct list. We're gonna see if I actually read it. The second book on this list is 1Q84 by Haruki Murakami. This was published in 2009, it is translated from the original Japanese, and this isn't going to be the first time I've read Haruki Murakami. There was a time when I was obsessed with him. I read Men Without Women, the Rat series, not the first one, but we're not going to get into why, Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World. So I've read quite a few books by him. There was a time I was devouring all of his work, and so then of course I ended up buying this, and then for whatever reason I stopped being interested in reading him, and now I have this huge chunker on my TBR. And honestly, I mean, I'm not the only girl who once in a while likes to book with a booty, but I will say this is quite the chunker for me, and I don't know if I really can see myself mentally reading this, but I have to, because I can't keep looking at it on my shelf. I can't. What's really cool about this one though is it is set in Tokyo. It's a bit of an alternate history because it's set in 1984. But our main character, she seems to be aware of this parallel universe that she calls 1Q84. And from what I can tell, it's a huge genre blend of not only like historical fiction, but fantasy, a bit of sci-fi, maybe a bit of dystopia as well. There seems to be a lot of odd characters. The only concern I have with this, and partially why I've been steering away from Haruki Murakami, is that sometimes his work does become quite sexist. The gender roles are very much like archaic. Women's bodies are objectified in a certain way and women are judged by the way they look. And so I think that's also why I haven't really been interested in trying him as of late. But I gotta read it. I have to do it. So on the list it goes. Speaking of books with booty, I also have White Teeth by Zadie Smith. So I have a very strange relationship with Zadie Smith because I have read her before as well. However, that relationship compared to Murakami has just been bad. I only read On Beauty by her, and honestly, I really disliked that book. Every single character there was just horrible. There's only one character that I was hoping to succeed in whatever her goals were, and everyone else was just honestly insufferable. The only reason why I even finished that book was because I actually was assigned it as a TA to teach it to other students, so I had to be prepared for the course that I was teaching. And so I'm kind of worried about White Teeth. I did end up buying it years ago because a friend who also read On Beauty and hated it loved White Teeth. She said this one is far, far better. She adored it, and I very much respect this friend's opinion. There's another book on this list that she gave me, and so we'll get into that in a little bit. But I'm assuming that this one's going to be really crucial to race relations. And what's really interesting about it, I will say, is that apparently it follows two unexpected friends. You wouldn't expect them to be friends, and they're both veterans from World War I, and it's set in England, which is kind of an interesting perspective as someone who's from the US and has read a lot of post-World War I literature set in the US. So I do want to give it a chance because, like I said, I had a friend who also didn't like On Beauty, but she loved this, and so I feel like maybe I need to give this author one more chance because I feel like she's such an influential author as far as the modern classic goes. So I should try to read more of her. The fourth book on this list is The Monsters of Templeton by Lauren Groff. Now I'm assuming this one's probably not a title that you associate with Lauren Groff, but there's many others. Arcadia is one that I read that I absolutely adored. There's also Fates and Furies, Florida. She's been a finalist for, I think it was the Booker Award or the National Book Award multiple times. So she's a very well-known, well-loved author in the literary community, and I own Fates and Furies. I also own Florida, and I own, obviously, The Monsters of Templeton, but the only book I've actually read by her was Arcadia. I think I just kept picking up books by her from secondhand shops, knowing that I loved Arcadia at the time that I was just kind of collecting books for the sake of collecting them. And now I'm like, Leandra, you need to read more by this author because you own 3 books by her that you haven't read. And so I ended up choosing the earliest one. This was in 2007, I believe. 2008, actually. So this came out in 2008, and I really want to look at some of her earlier work, especially because I believe Fates and Furies and Florida are among her newer collection or part of her newer canon. This one seems really intriguing though. The cover itself is really interesting. Apparently it follows a young girl who's searching for her father, but it's partially historical fiction, partially a ghost story as well. There's a bit of a mystery going on, some magical realism. It spans across 2 centuries, I believe. So I'm intrigued. I also like the fact that Lauren Groff grew up in New York, in upstate New York, and that's where I'm originally from. And so I really like how rich she makes the settings. She tends to make the settings. Arcadia was also set in New York, and it was very rural and just beautifully environmental, and people don't really think about that when they're thinking of New York. They usually think of New York City, and so I really love how she writes that specific setting. And so I'm forcing myself as like a positive thing. It's not because I think I'm going to dislike this book like I've been avoiding the others, but I think I've just been neglecting it, and I really do think I'm going to enjoy her writing more than I've already have. So yeah, so that's why this is on the list. And book number 5 is What Once Was Mine. This is part of the Twisted Tales YA fantasy fairy tale retelling series, and I've never read any of them. I ended up buying this on a whim just because one of my favorite Disney films is Tangled, and I really liked the idea of spinning the narrative on its head instead of feeding our young Rapunzel as a baby. The Sundrop flower, she is fed the Moondrop flower, and rather than her having this magical power of healing, she has this magical power of hurting people, and how that very much affects the story and makes it a bit darker, makes the conflict a bit more serious. I don't know. I'm interested to see what it's like. The one reason that I haven't really been picking it up is because, I don't know, I haven't been in a YA mood. I also have heard from some people that this author, specifically Liz Braswell, isn't their favorite because Twisted Tales is written by multiple authors depending on which story you choose. And so a friend of mine isn't a huge fan of this specific author in the series. On top of that, I have seen other booktubers discuss it as being actually more marketed for middle grade. Like in other countries, this is sat on the middle grade juvenile shelf rather than in YA. So I'm wondering how young it is. And so I don't know. I really haven't been that interested in it, even though the cover's really beautiful. The premise is really cool. So I gotta read it so I can at least, if anything, DNF it and then give it to a better home who actually will adore it. So that's kind of my goal for all of these books, is at least try them, and then if they're not for you, I can pass them on to other readers who will give these a second chance. Next, we're going a bit more classic, a bit more literary fiction, and that is Empire Falls by Richard Russo. I haven't read anything by Richard Russo, but he did win the Pulitzer Prize for this specific title. It did come out in 2001, so this is one of my earliest titles on this list, and I obviously haven't had it on this shelf for that long, but I have had it on my shelf for a good many years at a time when I was just collecting a bunch of prize-winning books to, I don't know, feel very literary and very smart, and then I proceeded not to read any of them, and a couple of them are on this list actually, but this is the first one I'm really talking about. So what's interesting about this one is that it's very contemporary. I don't tend to read contemporary fiction very much, literary fiction anymore, since I graduated undergrad, but I am intrigued by the fact that it is set in a blue-collar America setting. That's what it's kind of most known for, that it presents us with a blue-collar setting that's very impactful. It's very humorous, but also very like heartbreaking. There's a lot of heartache in here, and so I do want to give it a shot just to see if I can get myself back into a bit of literary fiction. All right, book 7 on this list is Tana French's In the Woods. I bought this one after I heard her on an interview with a podcast once, and it was really thoughtful. I really like the way she speaks. She also since then has been on the She Done It podcast, which I work for, and she was a brilliant guest. I highly recommend you go check out that specific episode where she's interviewed. I actually am more interested in a different title by her, and it's called The Searcher. That one seemed like it was influenced by the American Wild West, but set in Ireland. With that said, though, when I was looking to pick up a book by her, I decided to try In the Woods because a lot of other people were recommending that that's where you should start, and I didn't want to start with her newest book at the time. I wanted an earlier title, and so this one actually ended up coming out in the earlier 2000s, 2007, so it has been quite some time, and I have also heard a lot of people who have tried this one and DNF'd it. I believe that Danny over at Danny Dabble said that she ended up DNFing this book, so I am a bit nervous, and there has been whatever reason that I haven't been gravitating towards it myself. It is a bit of it seems like a wintry, maybe fall book, so maybe it is the perfect time for me to read it now, but I'm putting it on my 2024 self-destruct list anyway. So what this book involves is a bit of a cold case, or at least two dual timelines. So we have an earlier timeline where it's set in Dublin. These 3 children don't come home after dark when their parents call to them. The police are sent for, and then they end up discovering one of those 3 children in the woods, and there's a lot of mystery involved with what happened. He has blood on his shoes. No one really knows the events going on, and it doesn't seem that he's very much willing to divulge them. 20 years later, that same child ends up being a detective for, I believe it's the murder squad. The Dublin murder squad. And now it seems as though history is repeating itself. Another child, a 12-year-old, is discovered in the woods. And so he's being forced to kind of reflect on the events that he went through as a child. Do they connect? What went on then? What's going on now? So it is a very intriguing premise again, but the question is, can I get myself to read it? And if I can't, well, you know what? I won't have another chance to do it unless I buy it again or borrow it from the library. All right, this next one's a bit tricky because I think I'm gonna have to reread a book in order to fully enjoy this one, and maybe that's why I've been hesitant to read it up until this point, and that is The Story of a New Name. This is by Elena Ferrante. It's a part of the Neapolitan novels series. It's translated from Italian. The first book is My Brilliant Friend. I read that a few years ago, and I did absolutely adore it. It's historical fiction. It's set in Naples, Italy, following these 2 young women who are growing up in a very much patriarchal society trying to survive their childhood, trying to survive their young womanhood, and then how their friendship evolves through those experiences. My Brilliant Friend, again, it was brilliant. I gave it 5 stars, but then when I bought this one, immediately I proceeded not to read it, and now since so much time has passed, I really feel like to do this book justice, I'd have to go back and read My Brilliant Friend, which I do own. I could do that very easily, but I am not a big rereader, as anyone knows who has seen this channel for any amount of time, and so I'm really struggling with the idea of going backwards in order to move forwards for this, but I'm putting it on this list because if I don't read it now, will I really ever read it later? Plus there's a rereadathon happening in December. It's a month-long readathon focusing on rereading, and I feel like, come on, this is my chance. If I can reread My Brilliant Friend in December, then that gives me the perfect opportunity to have it refresh my brain and then go into the story of A New Name, which is honestly a beautiful title too. Book number 9 is one of my newest titles that I own, that also is one of the newest titles published. It's only beaten out by What Once Was Mine because that one was published back in 2021. But this one, published in 2020, was Plain Bad Heroines. It's another big read, another book with a booty, and this one, it's nearly 600 pages, which is just kind of insane, and that's definitely impactful for why I haven't picked it up, but I did buy it on a whim actually when I was visiting home back in New York, a small bookstore that's in my town that I always want to support when I'm home. I did end up buying it honestly without even thinking about it. I loved the title. I loved how kind of gothic it seemed, and then I was pleasantly surprised to learn that not only is it gothic inspired, but we have a lot of queer feminist commentary going on here. We follow the events that occur about over a century earlier at this academy. I think it's called Brooksbent School for girls. These 2 characters and what they go through there, and then the school, its history ends up kind of being brought back into modern life, modern discussion when this book comes out, written by an author, kind of bringing it back into the light. And so it does seem like it's, again, a dual timeline, historical fiction, a bit of mystery as well. And I'm really intrigued to see how bad these heroines actually are, and if it's a matter of society viewing them as bad when in reality they were progressive, which, you know, par for the course. Book 10 is Inland by Taya Obret. You may have remembered back when I was discussing White Teeth, I had a friend who loved On Beauty. No, she did not. She hated On Beauty, loved White Teeth, and I mentioned she also gave me another book to read, and that was Inland. But she did give me this book with a small kind of note of saying, don't bother reading it anytime soon. It's not as good as her other book that we absolutely adored, which was The Tiger's Wife. And The Tiger's Wife is honestly a book I still think about all the time. It is brilliant. It's so good. I don't see enough people talking about it. And so because my friend and I adored that one, we were so excited for Inland, and she ended up pre-ordering it. I didn't do that, and then she ended up just giving me this book because she wasn't as in love with it as the first one. It is a standalone, it's not a series, but because she said, oh, don't really bother reading it, I have proceeded to just leave it on my shelf since she gave it to me, which was the year that it was published, back in 2019. So this has been on my shelves for almost 5 years. Isn't that kind of crazy to think about? But this one involves historical fiction, a bit of magical realism, and it does say that it's based on kind of true events, or at least inspired by a true history that is really lesser known. It's set in Arizona back in 1893, and it seems as though it's been inspired with like Western elements as well, if I am understanding correctly. I haven't gravitated towards it. I do think that's mainly because my friend already warned me it wasn't going to be as good as The Tiger's Wife, and as soon as you know that, you're like, well, I guess I don't have to read it anytime soon, and I proceeded to like follow that mode to the end. But I'm gonna try and read it in 2024. If I don't, then honestly, I don't think I'll ever read it. This next one is probably gonna pain me if I don't actually read it in 2024 because I'll have to give it away, and that is Warlock Holmes, A Study in Brimstone. This is the first book in the Warlock Holmes series. It's very much obviously a retelling of Sherlock Holmes. However, the tagline is that yes, Sherlock Holmes is brilliant, but Warlock Holmes is an idiot. And I just love the idea of kind of spinning that narrative on its head. As you can kind of tell, I tend to be a fan of those types of narratives, hence why I have What Once Was Mine and a few others. But I really love the idea of the very brilliant Sherlock Holmes, how often people retell him and keep him with his brilliance. Someone being like, you know what, let's actually make him really dumb. And the person that he actually is very dependent on is Dr. Watson, his sidekick character, that a lot of people like to make fun of because of his sentimentalism, because he's a doctor and yet he's the one who's constantly trying to keep up with Sherlock. So I really like the fact that Warlock's a bit of a bumbling idiot who just kind of stumbles upon the solution thanks to his friends and other things. Also the fact that he's a warlock, that shows that not only is this historical fiction a retelling of a very classic detective fiction tale, but it involves paranormal and fantastical elements. Apparently the inspectors that he works with include a vampire and an ogre. So I do think this would be so much fun. It's a mashup of 6 classic Sherlock Holmes tales, if I'm understanding correctly. So like I haven't been prioritizing it. It was published in 2016. I haven't had it on my shelves for that long, but I probably have had it on my shelves for nearly as long as Inland. So it's been quite a few years, and I need to get to it. I think the reason why I haven't is because I wanted to read all of Sherlock Holmes first, and I have read some Sherlock Holmes, but the last one I read, A Study in Scarlet, obviously a play on, this is a play on that, A Study in Brimstone. I didn't like that. I also didn't like The Sign of the Four. And so I'm kind of like, oh God, I really don't like Sherlock Holmes very much. And so I'm kind of nervous about, getting into more of his novel work, his novel length work. I love his short stories, but every time I read a novel or novella by Arthur Conan Doyle, I actually hate him more. So yeah, that's probably why I haven't been prioritizing this one. Now, number 12 is actually super obscure, and it's not to say, oh, look at me finding all of these weird books, but I definitely found it on a whim and just bought it very randomly, and I haven't seen anyone talk about it. I think it only has a few thousand reviews on Goodreads, and so that's partially why I haven't really been prioritizing it, because I haven't seen people talk about it, and it hasn't interested me. But it's called The Afterlives, and I really want to force myself to try to read this so that I can just kind of give it away, or I can be like, oh yes, a hidden gem that I've had on my shelves and I'm so stupid for not reading it sooner. I want to know which one I am, and so that's why I've put this slightly obscure book on my list. It was published back in 2018. I probably have had it for nearly that long, which is, again, crazy to think about. It's sci-fi, but a bit of also kind of fantasy magical realism. Basically what happens is the main character, he dies in his 30s, and they say, oh, heart attack or heart failure or something like that, and then they end up being able to bring him back. And no, he doesn't remember anything. There's no kind of light at the end of the tunnel that he recalls. He thinks he sees a ghost, but maybe he doesn't. They're not really sure what he's seeing, and so they start kind of investigating and figuring out what's going on with him when he was brought back from the dead, arguably. And there's mentions of like existentialism, what happens after you die, what happens if you come back from the dead. And there's also discussions of like going and seeing psychics, holograms. That's where the kind of sci-fi elements coming in. So it might be a bit of an alternate universe as well, where science and technology is a bit more advanced than we have it today. But I am intrigued by it. It seems like it'd be probably a quick, chill read, but again, probably because no one's talked about it, and I'm not sure if anyone here watching this has heard of it and can tell me what their thoughts were on it. But I feel like this was a book that probably fell through the cracks, and because it didn't get much of viewing from others, I proceeded to kind of ignore it too. Book 13 is The True History of the Kelly Gang by Peter Carey. This is another kind of modern classic that a lot of people adore. It's very much literary fiction. It won the Booker Prize, and again, I kind of bought it around the same time I bought Empire Falls, for the same reasons, where I was like, oh, I want to be a smart literary person, and just because you own it doesn't mean that you are. With this one though, it actually does sound really cool. It's set in Australia, which I love. I find that very fascinating. And it's also a narrative being told by Netgalley, this kind of infamous criminal. People see him as, a thief, a murderer, just this very bad type. The whole point of it though is that there's far more, than what you see. There's more below the surface, and so that's why he's telling his narrative. That's why we're kind of getting more of a background on the events for a different perspective on the same narrative that's been told about him and his gang. So it does seem really thoughtful. Again, I like the idea of it being in Australia, being a bit of a Western, but not in the Western that we would expect. So it does seem very cool. I don't know why. I haven't really been interested in outlaw tales recently, but I think I'm more into them now because I've been reading a lot of hard-boiled fiction, and a lot of that is kind of the theme of hard-boiled detective fiction is often the broken man come hero. And so I feel like with Westerns, with outlaw tales, it's usually around that same theme too. The second to last book on this list is another obscure one. It is called All the World's a Grave. This is by John Reed. And I ended up picking this one up back when I was kind of researching professors, when I was thinking about where I wanted to get my master's. I decided to buy a bunch of books by professors from various universities just to see, you know, if I gravitated towards any of them, if I thought they were interesting, and then I proceeded to not read this one. And I actually think that was kind of a blessing in disguise, because last spring during my own master's program, I ended up reading a lot of Shakespeare because I was taking a Shakespeare course. And now that I feel as though I have a better grasp of his canon, specifically his comedies and his romances, his comedies and his histories, I'm really actually a bit more equipped to read this, especially because prior to that class, my only experiences with him were his tragedies and romances. So I was able to fill up my knowledge in areas that I didn't have any knowledge before. With that said though, with every passing day, I'm sure my memories of Shakespeare are depleting. And so I really need to read this so I can get as many of the references as I can. What's really cool is it's a bit of a hodgepodge of all of the Shakespeare canon kind of world being brought together. We've got Juliet hanging out with Hamlet, King Lear, Iago, Romeo, all of them together in one stage. And so I am really intrigued to see how they interact with each other and probably how hilarious it is. But again, I feel like I've got to read it within the year, because if I don't, I'm not going to care about Shakespeare anymore. We're lucky I care about him now. And finally, the 15th book on this self-destruct list is The Philosopher's Flight. This is by Tom Miller. I did get it way back in the day when I was a Book of the Month subscriber. On the back of my book, it does say February 2018. So again, a really long time this has been on my shelf, and I haven't had any interest in reading it. You can also see I have a couple Book of the Month books behind me too. So there's a couple stragglers that I've just kind of been letting them hang around, like, I don't know, very annoying tenants that I just can't seem to evict. But anyways, so with this one, what's kind of cool about it is there is a lot going on that I should like. The fact that it's historical fiction, but also sci-fi alternate history. I didn't know anything about this until I did research for this video, and I will say that there are some elements that I'm a bit nervous about now that I actually know more about this alternate history world. Specifically the fact that our main character, he seems to be experiencing a bit of a gender flip than what we actually experienced back in history, whereas men are ostracized, they're rejected from certain elite circles, they're being discriminated against. And one thing that he's being discriminated against is he wants to study this one particular area of science. It's called empirical philosophy. It's known as an arcane female-dominated branch of science. And he ends up being accepted to this college, Radford College, I think, that's an all-women school. And he's the only man, apparently, in this program who's learning with other women. And so I think he's going to be experiencing certain experiences of sexism and, you know, just kind of reverse roles between what it was actually like for women. And I don't know if I am interested in a man reflecting on what it's like. I don't know. And I know that it probably is quite thoughtful and interesting, and it is kind of literature that we do need. We do need men to be discussing feminism and discussing historical discrimination, societal discrimination that continues throughout society, and also not just as far as genders go. And this is, of course, also a bit already, I don't know, it's already aged a bit because it seems as though we're talking about gender on a binary. So I don't know. We're gonna see how I feel about it, but either way, I need to either try it or get rid of it, because I literally have just been staring at it for a really long time, and I don't know what's made me keep it for this long. So one more year. That's what you got. One more year. All right, those are the 15 books that are on my self-destruct TBR for 2024. I'm really excited, especially because either way it's going to be a win. I'm either going to relieve my shelves of 15 books because I didn't read them, or I'll actually be trying them, and hopefully whatever the outcome is, I'll be finding amazing books that I'm so glad I finally read, or books that, yeah, there was a reason why I didn't read them any sooner, so glad that the case is closed on that one. What books would be on your self-destruct list if you have them? If you're a booktuber who's created your own self-destruct list for 2024, be sure to link it below. Let people know that you're a booktuber so that we can expand our community, expand our friendships. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really appreciate you being here, and I hope to see you in the next one. All right, bye everybody.